The scream that shattered the desert dawn wasn't human, but it carried a pain so raw that Ayana's blood turned cold in his veins. He had been tracking deer through the Chiricahua Mountains for 3 days, moving like smoke between the towering saguaros and jagged rocks that had sheltered his people for generations, when that terrible cry echoed off the canyon walls like the voice of a dying spirit. Ayana pressed himself against the rough bark of a Palo Verde tree, his dark eyes scanning the rust-colored landscape that stretched endlessly under the merciless Arizona sun. At 24, he had heard the death songs of many creatures, had witnessed the brutal ballet of predator and prey that played out daily in this unforgiving land, but this sound was different. This was not the natural order of things. This was something born of cruelty. The cry came again, weaker now, from somewhere beyond the next ridge. Ayana's weathered fingers tightened around his hunting bow as he moved forward, his moccasined feet finding purchase on stones that would have sent a white man tumbling into the thorny embrace of beryl cacti below. His grandfather had taught him to read the desert like other men read books, and every broken twig, every disturbed pebble, told him a story that made his jaw clench with growing unease. Blood. Fresh blood, dark and still warm, staining the pale sand in droplets that led upward toward a cluster of boulders where the morning shadows still lingered. But it wasn't deer blood, nor the crimson of a rabbit taken by hawk or coyote. This was the deep red of something larger, something that had been running hard and bleeding harder. As Ayana crested the ridge, moving with the fluid grace that had made him one of the finest trackers in his band, he saw the source of those agonized cries. A massive gray wolf lay panting in the meager shade of an ironwood tree, its silver coat matted with blood and dust. The animal's yellow eyes, wild with pain and something that looked disturbingly like human fear, fixed on Ayana's approach. Most wolves would have fled or attacked, but this one simply watched him with an intelligence that raised the hair on the back of the Apache's neck. The wolf was magnificent, easily the largest Ayana had ever seen, with shoulders that would have reached a man's waist and paws broader than a human hand. But magnificence meant nothing when faced with the horror that had been visited upon the creature. Its left flank bore a mark that made Ayana's stomach lurch with disgust and fury. Someone had pressed a white-hot iron against the wolf's hide, burning deep into flesh and fur to leave a symbol that was unmistakably man-made. The brand was crude but deliberate, forming the letters, GM, in angry, blistered flesh that wept blood and clear fluid. Ayana had seen cattle branded, had watched white ranchers mark their property with similar callousness, but never had he witnessed such cruelty inflicted upon a wild creature. The wolf's breathing was labored, each rise and fall of its massive chest accompanied by a soft whimper that spoke of agony beyond endurance. Blood seeped from deep gashes along its hindquarters, wounds that looked suspiciously like they had been made by steel traps, the kind used by miners and trappers who cared nothing for the sacred balance of the desert. The Apache warrior knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening as he studied the injured animal. His people believed that wolves were messengers from the spirit world, creatures that walked between the realm of the living and the land of the ancestors. To harm one deliberately was to invite the wrath of powers far older and more terrible than any human understanding. But someone had done exactly that, and the evidence lay bleeding before him. As if sensing his thoughts, the wolf struggled to its feet, swaying dangerously as it fought to remain upright. Its yellow gaze never left Ayana's face, and in those ancient eyes, the young Apache saw something that chilled him more than the desert wind that had begun to whistle through the canyon. The wolf was trying to communicate, trying to show him something. It took one halting step away from the tree, then another, pausing to look back as if to ensure Ayana was following. Against every instinct his grandfather had drilled into him about approaching wounded predators, against the voice in his head that whispered warnings about spirits and omens, Ayana found himself rising to follow the limping wolf. The creature moved slowly, clearly in tremendous pain, but with a determination that spoke of urgent purpose. It led him along a game trail that wound deeper into the mountains, through stands of ocotillo that clawed at their passage and across dry creek beds where flash floods had carved their signatures in stone. The higher they climbed, the more the landscape changed. The familiar saguaros gave way to pine and juniper, and the air grew thin and crisp with the promise of approaching winter. Ayana had hunted these mountains since childhood, but the wolf was leading him into territory he had never explored, following paths that seemed to exist only in the minds of wild things. The blood trail grew heavier as they progressed, and several times Ayana was certain the great animal would collapse and refuse to continue. But the wolf pressed on with a stubbornness that bordered on supernatural, occasionally pausing to rest in whatever shade it could find, always looking back to ensure its human companion had not abandoned the journey. Hours passed in this strange procession, the sun climbing higher and transforming the desert air into something that shimmered like water above sun-baked stones. Ayana's water gourd grew light, his throat parched, but something about the wolf's desperate determination kept him moving forward. It was near midday when they reached the entrance to a canyon Ayana had never seen before, a narrow slash in the mountain face that seemed to swallow light and sound. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, carved from red sandstone that glowed like fresh blood in the harsh sunlight. Ancient petroglyphs covered the lower portions of the rock faces, symbols left by people who had walked this land long before the Apache, long before the white men with their iron tools and hungry eyes. The wolf paused at the canyon mouth, its massive head turning to fix Ayana with that unervingly intelligent stare. Then it spoke, not with words but with a sound that was part whine, part growl, and entirely unlike anything Ayana had ever heard from a wild animal. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, seeming to multiply and grow until it became a chorus of ghostly voices that made the young Apache's skin crawl. Without waiting for a response it couldn't possibly understand, the wolf limped into the canyon's shadow-shrouded depths. Ayana hesitated for a moment, every survival instinct screaming warnings about following wounded animals into unknown territory, about canyons that could become traps if flash flood struck, about the strange behavior of a creature that should have fled or attacked rather than led him on this mysterious journey. But the wolf's pain was real, and something about its desperate urgency suggested that whatever lay ahead was more important than the natural order of predator and prey. Ayana stepped into the canyon, immediately feeling the temperature drop as the high walls blocked the desert sun. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft pad of his moccasins on stone and the labored breathing of his unlikely guide. The canyon wound deeper into the mountain, sometimes narrowing to passages barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, sometimes opening into circular chambers where ancient floods had carved smooth amphitheaters from living rock. In some of these spaces, Ayana found evidence of human presence, fire-blackened stones arranged in careful circles, fragments of pottery decorated with symbols he didn't recognize, and always, everywhere, the strange petroglyphs that seemed to watch their passage with hollow, timeless eyes. The wolf's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Its gait had become increasingly unsteady, and the blood trail it left behind was growing wider and darker. Several times Ayana was certain the creature would finally collapse, but each time it managed to find the strength to continue, driven by whatever urgent purpose had brought them to this hidden place. It was the smell that told Ayana they were approaching their destination long before he saw anything unusual. The canyon had been filled with the clean scents of stone and sparse desert vegetation, but now something else began to intrude, the metallic tang of worked metal, the acrid bite of coal smoke, and underneath it all, something organic and unpleasant that made his nose wrinkle in disgust. The wolf had stopped moving. It stood swaying in a patch of shadow cast by an overhanging ledge, its yellow eyes fixed on something ahead that Ayana couldn't yet see. The creature's breathing had become so labored that each exhale was accompanied by a soft whistle that spoke of internal injuries far worse than the visible wounds. Ayana moved past the wolf, keeping low and using the canyon wall for cover as he advanced toward whatever had drawn them both to this remote place. The smell grew stronger with each step, and now he could hear sounds that had no business existing in this wilderness sanctuary, the rhythmic clank of metal on metal, voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, and underneath it all, a low moaning that raised every hair on his body. He reached a bend in the canyon and carefully peered around the edge of stone that blocked his view. What he saw drove the breath from his lungs and sent ice flooding through his veins despite the desert heat. Carved into the canyon wall ahead was the entrance to a mine, its mouth framed by rough wooden timbers that looked relatively new. Smoke drifted from somewhere within the depths, and the sounds he had been hearing grew clearer and more distinct. But it was what lay outside the mine entrance that made Ayana's hands shake with barely controlled rage. A series of wooden posts had been driven into the ground, and chained to these posts were human beings. Men, women, even children, all bearing the distinctive features and clothing remnants that identified them as members of various tribal nations. Apache, Navajo, Pueblo, others he couldn't immediately identify, all reduced to the status of animals by iron shackles that had worn bloody grooves in their wrists and ankles. And every single one of them bore fresh brands, burned into their flesh with the same letters he had seen on the wolf, GM. Some of the brands were old enough to have begun healing, forming raised scars that would mark these people for life. Others were so fresh that the smell of burned flesh still lingered in the air, mixing with smoke and human misery to create an atmosphere of hell on earth. The wolf had followed him and now stood at Ayana's side, its yellow eyes reflecting an intelligence and sorrow that seemed almost human. The creature looked up at him once, then deliberately limped toward the mine entrance, its intentions clear despite its inability to speak. It was going inside, whether Ayana followed or not. The young Apache warrior checked his weapons, his bow, his knife, the small hatchet at his belt that had belonged to his father. Against whatever forces had created this nightmare, they seemed pitifully inadequate. But the wolf was already disappearing into the darkness of the mine shaft, following some inner compass toward whatever final revelation awaited them both in the depths of the mountain. The darkness inside the mine swallowed Ayana like the throat of some ancient beast, and for a moment the contrast between the harsh desert sunlight and the absolute blackness left him blind and vulnerable. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene, sweat, and something else that made his stomach turn, the metallic scent of fear and desperation that clung to places where human suffering had soaked into the very stones. His eyes gradually adjusted to reveal a nightmare carved from living rock. The mine tunnel stretched ahead into depths that seemed to have no end, supported by rough timber beams that creaked ominously under the weight of the mountain above. Kerosene lanterns hung at irregular intervals, casting dancing shadows that transformed every corner into a potential hiding place for unspeakable horrors. The wolf had disappeared into this labyrinth, but its blood trail continued along the mine floor, dark droplets that seemed to glow in the flickering light. The sounds that had been muffled outside now echoed with terrible clarity through the tunnels. Metal striking stone in rhythmic patterns, the creak and groan of machinery, and underneath it all, the soft weeping of human voices raised in languages that spoke of tribes scattered across the southwest. But there was something else, something that made Ayana's warrior instinct scream warnings he couldn't yet understand, the sound of children's voices, high and thin with exhaustion, coming from somewhere deeper in the mountain's belly. He moved forward with the silence his grandfather had taught him, each footstep placed with the care of a hunter stalking prey through territory that belonged to death itself. The tunnel branched and split like the roots of some underground tree, and at each junction the wolf's blood trail continued deeper, always deeper, as if the creature was drawn by instincts older than conscious thought toward whatever secret lay at the heart of this mountain. The first side chamber Ayana passed contained equipment that made his blood run cold. Branding irons hung from hooks driven into the stone walls, their metal tips still warm from recent use. Coils of chain and rope were stacked in corners, along with leg irons and manacles that bore the stains of blood and rust. But it was the wooden table in the center of the chamber that told the true story of this place's purpose. Its surface was scarred with burn marks in the shape of letters and numbers, and the wood itself was stained dark with substances Ayana didn't want to identify. A ledger lay open on the table, its pages filled with entries written in a careful hand that spoke of education and deliberate cruelty. Ayana could read English well enough to understand what he was seeing, and the knowledge hit him like a physical blow. Names, ages, tribal affiliations, and beside each entry a number that seemed to represent some kind of monetary value. The entries dated back 3 years, and the numbers grew larger with each page, suggesting a business that had grown increasingly profitable over time. But it was the notation beside many of the names that made Ayana's hands shake with rage. Training complete appeared again and again, followed by destinations that read like a map of wealthy households across the Arizona territory and beyond. These people weren't just being held captive, they were being broken, trained, and sold like livestock to buyers who saw Native Americans as something less than human. The wolf's trail led him past chamber after chamber, each revealing new horrors that built upon the last. A room filled with children's clothing, carefully mended and arranged by size. Another containing medical supplies and instruments that could have come from a doctor's office, if doctors made their living by ensuring their patients remained healthy enough to work but never strong enough to fight. And always, deeper into the mountain, the sounds of human misery echoed through stone corridors that seemed designed to amplify suffering. It was in the largest chamber that Ayana finally found the wolf, and the sight that greeted him there would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The space had been carved from the mountain's heart and expanded with crude but effective engineering, creating a vast underground hall lit by dozens of lanterns and heated by braziers that filled the air with smoke and dancing shadows. 3 separate tunnel entrances led deeper into the mine, and from each came the sound of picks striking stone and the soft chanting of voices raised in work songs that spoke of despair beyond measure. But it was the center of the chamber that drew Ayana's horrified attention. A raised platform had been constructed from wooden planks, and upon this stage a scene was playing out that seemed torn from the deepest nightmares of his people. A white man in an expensive suit was addressing a small audience of well-dressed individuals who sat in chairs arranged in a rough semicircle. Behind him, chained to posts driven into the platform, stood a dozen Native Americans of various ages, all bearing the fresh brands that marked them as property. The wolf lay dying at the edge of the platform, its magnificent form reduced to labored breathing and eyes that had grown dim with approaching death. But even in its final moments, the creature's gaze remained fixed on the scene before them with an intensity that spoke of purpose beyond simple animal instinct. The man in the suit was speaking, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education and the cold calculation of a businessman who had found a particularly profitable market. He gestured toward his human merchandise with the casual air of someone discussing livestock at a cattle auction, and his words carried clearly through the chamber's acoustics. Gentlemen and ladies, what you see before you represents the culmination of 3 years of careful development and refinement. Each individual has been selected for specific qualities: intelligence, physical strength, docility achieved through proper training methods. The branding system ensures permanent identification and discourages attempts at escape, while our conditioning process guarantees workers who will perform their assigned tasks without the troublesome independence that has characterized previous labor arrangements. One of the audience members, a woman whose elaborate dress and jewelry spoke of considerable wealth, raised her hand with the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to having her questions answered immediately. What guarantees do we have regarding their continued cooperation once they're removed from this controlled environment? I've heard stories about domestic incidents involving untrained specimens. The suited man smiled with the confidence of someone who had answered this question many times before. An excellent inquiry, Mrs. Patterson. Our conditioning process involves a carefully calibrated combination of physical control and psychological manipulation. Each worker is separated from others of their tribe and placed with individuals from different nations, preventing the formation of solidarity that might lead to coordinated resistance. Additionally, we maintain detailed records of family members who remain in our custody, providing powerful motivation for continued cooperation. The casual cruelty of the discussion made Ayana's vision blur with rage, but it was the man's next words that sent ice through his veins. For those interested in our premium service, we also offer what we call the insurance package, the retention of children from the same family unit. This has proven remarkably effective in ensuring long-term compliance, as our workers demonstrate extraordinary dedication when the welfare of their offspring depends on their performance. A younger man in the audience leaned forward with the eager attention of someone discovering a new business opportunity. What about the mining operation itself? I understood this was primarily a gold extraction enterprise. The suited man's smile grew wider, and there was something in his expression that reminded Ayana of the look a coyote wore when it had cornered wounded prey. The mining operation serves multiple purposes, Mr. Harrison. Yes, we extract considerable quantities of gold and silver from these deposits, which helps fund our primary business. But more importantly, the mining work serves as our primary conditioning tool. Individuals who resist our training program spend time in the deep tunnels, where the combination of physical exhaustion, isolation, and carefully controlled fear breaks down psychological resistance with remarkable efficiency. He gestured toward one of the tunnel entrances from which the sound of picks on stone continued without pause. Our deepest workings extend nearly half a mile into the mountain, with conditions that become increasingly harsh the further one descends. Workers assigned to these areas quickly develop a strong preference for more cooperative behavior. The mortality rate is acceptable, particularly given the ready availability of replacement stock from tribal conflicts throughout the territory. The woman who had spoken earlier nodded with the satisfied air of someone whose investment concerns had been adequately addressed. And the wolf breeding program you mentioned in your correspondence? I confess I found that aspect of your operation rather intriguing. The man's expression grew animated, and he gestured toward where the dying wolf lay gasping at the platform's edge. Ah yes, one of our most innovative developments. We discovered that wolves captured and trained using our methods make extraordinarily effective tools for controlling our workforce. Their natural pack instincts can be redirected toward hurting human subjects, and their capacity for inflicting psychological intimidation far exceeds that of dogs or other domesticated animals. He walked over to where the wolf lay dying and nudged the creature's flank with his polished boot. Unfortunately, this particular specimen proved resistant to our conditioning process. We've had to discontinue the program temporarily while we refine our techniques, but I'm confident that future iterations will prove highly successful. The casual cruelty of the gesture, the complete lack of recognition that he was speaking of a living creature capable of suffering, finally broke through Ayana's self-control. The young Apache warrior had seen much of death and violence in his 24 years, had participated in raids against enemies of his people and witnessed the brutal realities of survival in an unforgiving land. But this systematic reduction of both human and animal life to mere economic units represented an evil that transcended anything in his experience. He drew his bow with movements fluid as water flowing over stone, knocking an arrow that had been crafted by his own hands from wood blessed by tribal elders and tipped with steel traded from Mexican merchants who still remembered how to treat with honor. The distance to the platform was perhaps 30 yards, well within the range at which he had killed deer running at full speed through mountain terrain far more challenging than this underground chamber. But as he drew back the bowstring, the dying wolf lifted its massive head and looked directly at him. In those fading yellow eyes, Ayana saw something that stopped his hand before he could loose the arrow. The creature was trying to communicate one final message, and the intelligence behind that gaze was so obviously deliberate that it cut through his rage like a blade through morning mist. The wolf was telling him to wait. To watch. To learn everything before he acted, because there was more to see, more to understand about the scope of the horror that had been carved into this mountain. The creature's eyes shifted toward the tunnel entrances, toward sounds coming from the depths that Ayana had been too focused on the immediate scene to fully comprehend. More voices. Many more voices. And the sound of feet moving through stone passages, approaching from multiple directions with the deliberate cadence of people being herded rather than walking freely. The auction was about to begin in earnest, and the full scope of this operation was about to reveal itself. The wolf's final breath left its body with a sound like wind sighing through canyon walls, and in that moment Ayana understood that he was no longer simply witnessing an atrocity. He had become the only hope these people had of seeing another sunrise as free human beings, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like the mantle of chieftainship his grandfather had always insisted would one day be his burden to bear. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and torchlight began to flicker in the tunnel mouths as guards brought forth the remainder of the human cargo that would be offered for sale to buyers whose wealth had insulated them from any recognition of their own monstrous inhumanity. Ayana remained motionless in the shadows at the chamber's edge, his bow still drawn, his mind calculating distances and angles and possibilities with the cold precision his grandfather had beaten into him during countless hours of training for a war he had never imagined would be fought in darkness beneath the earth against enemies who wore the faces of civilized men and women. The secret the wolf had died to show him was worse than anything his darkest imaginings could have conjured, and he was about to discover that what he had seen so far was only the beginning.